11 in the morning.
Sa, 1, 2, 3.
Great to meet you.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Perfect. Good afternoon. Welcome to this panel and to the second day on the meetings on architecture with the Symposium on Sustainability. Yesterday we had 3 panels looking at the philosophy of sustainability, looking at theoretical questions through the case study that Paola Vigano brought in about territoriality, and then additionally looking at questions of technology. We had the fortune of the participation of the Holcim Foundation and the Holcim team, who have been here to award the Holcim Foundation Awards on Saturday. Today we have 2 panels, one looking at a very critical question, which is the bringing of the questions of sustainability into the expressive dimension of architecture, and at the same time expanding from that into the artistic and cultural dimensions that architecture plays in conveying and absorbing the issues of sustainability. That will be our first panel, and the second panel will be looking at the global commons, extracting from the Biennale exhibition the section on across borders, a series of examples that really highlight the necessity for architecture to enter into the space that is across borders in order to address, redress, and mitigate the questions of the global commons. Let me start with the first panel. I'm also very pleased that joining me to moderate the first panel is Roy Salguero, who is the assistant curator of this Biennale and also lecturer at the Department of Architecture at MIT. Roy is from Galicia. He received his architecture education from Navarra and then his PhD from Barcelona. He's currently on the scientific committee of ACTAR and also editor-at-large of their Urban Next platform. The participants in this panel, and I will introduce them in their order of appearance, are 3 architects who have been very kind to present their work at the Biennale. I start with Patrick Berger, who obtained a PhD in town planning in 1977. In the 1990s, his work won 3 architecture awards for the School of Architecture in Rennes, the André Citroën Park in Paris, and the Bastille Viaduct. He was awarded the French National Grand Prix for Architecture in 2004. With his Canopy project, he and Jacques Anzuti won the international contest to renovate the Forum des Halles in Paris. In addition to his work as an architect, Patrick Berger devotes his time to teaching and research, notably at the EPFL in Lausanne. Our second presenter who will be joining us on Zoom is Maryam Kamara from Atelier Masomi. Maryam Kamara is a Nigerian architect and principal of Atelier Masomi. I'm sorry, she is a Nigerian architect and principal of Atelier Masomi. Her work uses design to strengthen communities while maintaining a dialogue among architecture, people, and the environment. Her projects have earned numerous accolades, including the 2018 Global Silver Lafarge-Holcim Award. She is a 2019 Prince Claus Award laureate and Sir David Adjaye's protégé in the 2018-2019 Rolex Mentor Protégé Initiative. Good to see you, Maryam. Our third panelist today is Alexia Leon. Alexia Leon and Lucio Marcial set up Leon Marcial Arquitectos Studio in 2011 in Lima, Peru. Leon studied architecture at Ricardo Palma University and opened her studio, Leon de Lima, in 2006. She taught as visiting professor at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard and was nominated for the Mies van der Rohe Prize for Latin America with Casamori at age 28, the Marcus Prize, MCHAP with Casa Vertical, and the BSI Swiss Architectural Award in 2016. Marcial received his B.Arch from Columbia University in New York City in 1985 and his master's from Harvard University, Cambridge, Massachusetts. After his studies, he worked with Rafael Moneo in Barcelona on large mixed-use urban projects, where he also founded Lucio Marcial Arquitectos in 1999, working on independent projects. Both Alexia and Lucio have given seminars, lectures, and workshops in Peru and abroad. The studio's built work rethinks the relationship between society, structural materiality, and landscape, at different territorial scales. Their most recent project, the National Museum of Peru, a public competition from 2014, is their last completed work and was built in the Pacacamac archaeological site. Please join me in welcoming our panelists, and we turn the mic to Patrick to get started. Patrick will be speaking in French, but there will be simultaneous translation.
I will try to do it in English.
Fantastic.
If
Okay.
it doesn't work, you stop me, we'll do it in English.
Fantastic. Sorry.
This pavilion that you can see on the site of this Biennale is a reproduction of the original one, which is built at the invitation of the consortium land in Burgundy, in France, close to a village called Grancy-le-Château. Before crossing the historical gate of this city, walking on the alley that leads there, you are able to see in the nearby wood a dome. Originally, it was designed for an open-air library which have to contain in furniture all the tales which have personified a bird. The tales of Christian Andersen, those of Charles Perrault, those of the Brother Grimm, those of De La Fontaine, all the book about fables and the surnaturel they have assigned to the goose, the swan, the crow, the goéland, the sea eagle. Other birds, but this one, they're real, alive in the wood, land on sometime on this pavilion or get inside. That is why it is called the bird pavilion, where fiction and reality intertwine. At first glance, from afar, it could appear primitive, but getting closer is not random. There is an order. Its elements create a clear path, its elements are regulated, and its oblong space lets slip between the trunk of the forest. We hesitate before a basketry walk or a corbelled construction. It is a steel structure raised with successive beds, while the tree branches that cover it were taken from the tree on the wood of Grancy-le-Château. When we see the branches, they have the size of the children, so we can think, is it a local children who built it? But also we can think, is it woven by the mythical Hercules bird, which took the size of a giant as the origin of society? It's half man, half animal. Half man, half animal, here we are. This dome is a tale. This tale is not illustrated, but built. This is what we imagine about this manufacture that tells us. It is a tale as an architectural genre or category. Why such a project? Tales without sounding like they can have powerful effect. Tales are told there and here, they travel on their own space, they can change form and language, but they are sustainable for their effect. In superficial aspect, they propagate philosophical ideas. The idea here is a question. What connection between man and animal today? It is a track. Let's follow it. Let's move on from idea to concrete experience. Starting from a seemingly innocuous place where an urban sprawl has nowadays intertwined the natural state and built, then see through this vagueness is opposite, a resource, a possible weaving, a situation will make it possible to spatially organize a coexistence between the sociable man and wild animals, each leading his life on his own at a measured distance. Proceed by progressive experimental effect, step by step, starting from a small scale, like in Grand-C'est-le-Château. Here is the next project that will be built near the pavilion. It's titled The Den of Living. It is a place where only animals enter and live. They live there in a field of massive stone. Man is excluded from this place, or rather is excluded here by his own will, because it is his project. It is so by imagining a space whose enclosure will never allow him to enter or even observe it in the future. There are access, but they are dimensioned for animals. The openings are closed by a maze of rocks where only some animal can circulate through. This space is thus protected from a This space is thus protected from any physical or visual intrusion of the human. Animals escape human, they escape his presence and his use. It even goes as far as control or his curiosity. They are hidden from his sight. It could look like a reversal cave, like the parietal cave, when man protects himself from the animals, but here it is the reverse. It looks also like a biological cell. We begin to divide into daughter cells, so it's a kind of den of living. But on the wall of this edicule, you can see a comparison between animal architecture and primitive architecture. We design it and analyze it like if they were on the same scale, like if it was, I would say, the same field. Carl von Fritsch, who was a protagonist of ethology, wrote that the animal architecture exists from millennia before the architecture of man. He wrote that they were in common to optimize the manufactory. He wrote that it is always the living body who build it, the end for man, the beak for bird, for example. And he wrote that architectural animal can be so monumental with corals that the monuments of man. When we analyze in a comparative way the primitive architecture of man coming from different environment and the architecture of animal, we discover a lot of things. And particularly, we discover that they use some animals use some sign, constructed sign, for communication, like for men. This animal use communicals this sign, of course, to attract the sexual partner, also, so it is for the reproduction of light. But the men use constructed sign to create, I will say, a sustainability of a social organization. These motifs that are coming from elements from animal architecture or primitive human architecture mixed together. I will paint it on the wall of this edicule, crossing, I will say, the symbolism and the knowledge or knowledge today of animal could be a track. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now go to Maryam online.
Thank you. I'm trying to figure out if I can share my screen for a second, for a quick, just a few slides. Sorry. It's always touch and go with this whole screen sharing. There we go. Oh, I'm so sorry.
Do you want us to shift order until Maryam figures it out? What do you think? Maryam, are you okay until you fix it? If we have Alexia present before?
Yes, that's totally fine. Thank you.
Very good. Okay. Alexia, are you ready? Thanks, Alexia.
Thank you, Hashim, for the invitation. I am really happy to share some thoughts. It's working? Okay. I'm happy to share some thoughts behind Interwoven, our installation. Interwoven celebrates the act of sharing and exchange between households and their environments through architectural means. Households impact the planet daily, not also in compact territories, but also in dispersed ones. The question that the curator Hashim Sarkis asked, how will we live together as new households? For us, lies not just in the households themselves, but between households and all spaces of cohabitation. We were very inspired by certain households' creativity in defining sustainable relationships with our surroundings. This reciprocal relationship often blurs the limits between natural and artificial systems for a common benefit. we decided to rethink the basic building blocks that built the cities of the past and are now building the cities of the present. The historical process of self-building and self-construction culture remains very much alive today. We learn from what we see and touch, and we learn from what we build together. We design for climate variations with its rapid changes of wind, light, temperature. We were inspired by Household's structural adaptations as an art of building without a specific program. We believe in exploring light construction systems that can be reused. Interwoven proposes an open, unenclosed spatial fragment. We wanted to deal with a transformation of the given space in the Arsenale, a physical integration through design interacting with the public nature of the corderie. Spatial fragments suggest to us how to interweave and integrate social interactions and transitions, dissolving outside, inside, and public-private boundaries. The one-to-one installation produces an atmosphere of a dynamic shared space, changing how we might relate spatially. Two freestanding elements placed in tension with one another are made up of 8 fabrics at the scale of the Arsenale and work as a hinge between different curatorial rooms. Interwoven avoids making any complete physical or visual barriers with its surroundings. This integration allows for a now that is a constant renewal, giving us an ocean of time. It's a form questioning temporality, relying on changing and not static relationships. Relating specific elements together through design requires steel and wood system that could grow or shrink, expand, or contract easily and flexibly. The wood, in this case, is the non-structural element. Each mantle of wooden blocks is woven into the metallic structure and attains stability only when the whole screen has been mounted. The geometry of the X-shaped plan is fundamental for its lateral stability. It's essential as the blocks perform no structural work because moving them is necessary. As an entity, Interwoven is supported by its weight and geometry. It's not an installation that can be simply transported and placed in the Arsenale. It attaches itself with pressure clamps to the existing beams that support the mezzanine and with its weight sit firmly on the Arsenale's floor. It is a structure that is assembled with no mechanical fixation to the existing building. In that sense, it gets dismantled with ease without damaging the building's fabric. The 2,000 movable Panguana blocks and metal pole structure create an architectural textile at the scale of the building. Walking through it establishes a new dialogue within the context of the Arsenale. We decided to design with wood, being conscious of how that affects the much vaster and endangered ecological system. Trees, of course, are not only a material resource and cannot be understood in isolation without an understanding of their environment and of the forest dynamics where the human and non-human can coexist sustainably. We decided to work with the fast-growth type C wood Panguana, a tropical wood of medium density, a wood that is generally discarded because it has no market, it is not commercially valuable. It's part of the high percentage of wood being cut down in the Amazon rainforest to gain access to commercial, slow-growth hardwood. Panguana is sometimes used for the construction of rafts that carry the huge trunks from primary forests to the ports of the Amazonian cities. There is a need to develop a relational conscience through design, an awareness of the value of the integrated whole, which is where sustainability lies. Local traditional arts and intercultural relationships rely on this. For us, Panguana block is a driver of change. Its asymmetrical shape in plan allows its rotation without clashing, and gives the function of interlocking when closed. The blocks have a head and a tail, which when rotated have a very different expressivity. The blocks are not solid elements, but laminated. Each block in itself is a construction of 6 separate wooden elements. There were careful calculations to meet our own need to economize, which is how it should be in general, maximizing the amount of usable wood from the tree, minimizing the number of cuts. As tools are used and invented to speed up production when fabricating 2,000 elements, it is necessary to introduce improvements along the way. Your mode of laminated, of cutting, of drilling, and sewing. It's poor craft. We aim to maximize our utilization of the wood with a minimum of resources with regard to cutting and drying, using 4 blocks of different height. Significantly reduce the waste, likewise with the drying, which was a slow drying process by evaporation. We calculated the different thickness of the wood in terms of the minimum amount of energy needed per block. This process was not possible without several prototypes with carpenters, designed by trial and error. When mounting the installation, moving the blocks is necessary. The installation cannot be mounted or assembled or put together using the screws unless the elements are physically rotated. This is fundamental. The rotated blocks create the space for the drill to fit in, to set the screws in place and join the 3 horizontal metal plates. It is important to understand that without this actual movement, the installation could not be constructed. As an incomplete structure attain its full installation, as an incomplete installation, one sees the horizontal metallic pieces sag, and only when completed does the structure attain its full stability. Completed parts of the screens work like a structural wall with openings over which they are bearing the lintels without perforation. The design is designed to allow for adjustments to the existing building, adapting its position in small ways to accommodate the existing conditions. The ultimate configuration of interwoven blocks was decided on site in order to better integrate the installation to its immediate environment. And finally, interwoven is capable of change and adaptability through the rotation of its blocks. In this way, it reshapes its spatial contract with its environment, reshaping the way we interact and coexist, an atmosphere that is much more closely linked to the construction of familiar dynamic landscapes. The installation tries to suggest new equitable possibilities for future communal living. Interwoven always has something old and something new. Craft carries ancestral knowledge that has undergone renewal, where one learns from what already exists, from what has been explored. Design is not about imposing ideas from above, detached from reality, but should be linked to the specific conditions and circumstances of the relationship between the human and the non-human. Design is a result of a meaningful collective dialogue and decision-making. As architects, we need to recognize households and communities as design institutions with powerful active roles in planning, conservation, and urbanization. This territorial knowledge has to be shared and reproduced everywhere. As designers, we need to be mediators of this knowledge for a better spatial future of habitation. We believe one must face the idea of building from that perspective if one thinks of households or homes or our planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexia. Let's see if Maryam is back and able to share. Maryam, success?
I hope I'll be, yes, I think I'll be more successful this time. So let me quickly switch. Yes. And it should be fast. I have very few
Yes.
slides.
have it.
You can see it, and then I just need to. If you can you see this well? No.
This one is perfect.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. This has been so inspiring, also listening to the first two panelists describe their work. I was in absolute awe. Like I said, mine will be quite quick. I just put together a brief number of slides to go over the installation that we had in the Arsenale. And the installation was really more of a collaboration between our firm and a collective of artisans who are in Niger, in Niamey, Niger's capital, because Niger is a country with a huge tradition of craft, whether it's metal craft, blacksmiths, leather craft, woodcraft. And for us, it was kind of a project that was in support of this development that we're doing for the artisans of the city, where we're designing a space for them within the city that we've been collaborating intensely in the design of. And so it speaks to this approach that we have in our work of thinking of sustainability in different modes, both in terms of direct environmental sustainability, but also in terms of cultural sustainability, economic sustainability, all of which to us come back and serve environmental sustainability ultimately. But for us, it was also a way of making a comment on, our place in the world, as we're talking about how do we live together, and our place in the world as so-called, developing countries, and the way that we're perceived, which is why this video, part of it was kind of in a cartoonish way, very much speaks to how, often caricatured, certain parts of the world are. And our installation was not only a way of bringing people together by designing, these two really tall fins and benches where you could sit around and see some video that kind of transport you into another world, into our world, brings you into our world. But then also sharing our world with, Venice and people who would be coming there by sharing this incredible skill and know-how these artisans have. And the kind of incredible intricacy with which their work and the richness with which their work, which, unfortunately always often goes, disregarded. So we kept it very, very simple, with simple shapes, simple, tiles, on the floor with these hand-carved bronzes that you saw earlier in the video that they were making literally just with very, very simple tools by hand to yield these absolutely exquisite pieces, one-off pieces, that are quite luxurious in their way, but then, they can actually be obtained so cheaply, unfortunately. So that's also kind of a commentary of how we live together in terms of, value that we bring into the world and kind of how that value is kind of either possessed or shared with other people. And for us, it was an opportunity to bring this value that they create and this richness that they create out into the world. All the while, hinting at what the project itself is, and the space that we're creating for them is, for us, that it was more about creating this direct connection between these two worlds and creating a space where these two worlds can kind of cohabit in how we live together. Keeping in mind that, part of the concept of the project is that these tiles that they created, particularly the ones that are on the floor that are made out of bronze, would capture the passage, of all of the people who would come through the Biennale, who would interact with this interaction as their shoes, scuff the ground, scuff, these exquisite designs, and will actually get dismantled and then taken back to Niger for another installation where then the artisans themselves will be, kind of the main actors of that installation. So for us, it was also about creating that dialogue between the Biennale, but also the producers of this installation that we did, to give them a really tangible, kind of interaction with a world that is thousands of miles away from their reality. And I think I would just keep it at that. Thank you.
Maryam, thank you so much. Roy, do you want to start?
Is this working? Yes. Yeah, I can. I'm happy to start. Thanks, Hashim. Well, thank you, Maryam. Thank you, Alexia. Thank you, Patrick, for the presentations. They have all been tremendously instructive and interesting. I would like, first of all, maybe like to emphasize the fact that the three of you are like from quite different contexts, and it is quite interesting like to see what you're doing like together, and also like that you are playing like a different role in the Biennale itself. Alexia participates in the as new household sections. You and Patrick are participating in the as emerging communities section. So despite the fact that all of you come from different places, despite the fact that you are working in different areas of the Biennale, the truth is that it is possible to see within your works quite interesting threads and approaches regarding what is the relationship between sustainability and more broadly like cultural and social production. There are, I would say, like many intriguing aspects on your presentations, but maybe like the first one that I would actually like elaborate is about, or I would ask you to elaborate a little bit more, is precisely how you see that possible interchange between different kind of a context and approaches. And let me maybe explain this a little bit more. Yesterday, in one of the conversations that we were having, there was somehow a little bit of a debate between the possible specificity of contexts where notions of sustainability were applied, and therefore like the necessity of having very specific solutions to them, and somehow like the creation of some kind of a broader frameworks that allow like to somehow like to have like common approaches towards like sustainability. Now, one of the things that I saw during your presentations, like the three of you, is that in a way you all require using somehow hybrid systems in a way, no? So both Alexia and Patrick, they are working with wood, but they are also working with metal. In your case, you're like actually recovering a very, reusing a very specific craft, Maryam, while also at the same time, certainly like using like different technologies. So I would really like to know maybe a little bit more how somehow like you employ different techniques, how you manage like techniques that are like specifically very characteristic of where you're working, and somehow how you think it is possible like to integrate other ones that can be a little bit more extraneous to the context where you work.
Okay. Bueno, I am Peruvian. That has Peru is a country that has a millenarian history, no, and that really influenced how we design at the studio. Craft is always there, no? The way in which one work with people. I think that technology works with social interactions, with contents. So we are building contents during the process of design. And we think that we need to work with sometimes with a local knowledge, with existing local knowledge. And we need to challenge it through design, no? And there are a lot of negotiations that are going on during the process that express in a material way, no? So it's a process of learning, of having a lot of mistakes and reduce all the time, no? So textile culture, ceramic culture, family agriculture culture. There are a lot of knowledge in Peru, and for us, it's super important to work with that knowledges. No?
Si j'ai bien compris votre question, c'est à propos de la fabrication, c'est bien ça? À propos de la fabrication dans le milieu.
The question was about construction in situ. First of all, I think we have lived for many years in a situation in which many architects worked with the concept of landscape, 18th, 19th century. I think today, instead, we refer to place. Landscape has been replaced by the place, the location, not only as a social term, but also from a cultural point of view. And architecture starts to have its own footprint on the landscape in order to create a place, an environment in which we have to live. As regards your question, I have the feeling that we spoke a lot of craftsmanship, of craft. You have a close link with craft. I do not have the same connection. Certainly, I have worked with the luxury craftsmanship. I have rather developed my connections with industry. It is very difficult today to find a balance between ecology and production, industrial works. It is a very sensitive balance that we have to find. And I think this is something the architect has to think on. First of all, the politicians have to. What I've shown you, the installation I've shown to you, had a theme. The theme is what brought me to choose certain materials. And the theme was the coexistence between the wild man and the social man. Is this coexistence possible? This was the question. How can we organize or let this relation organize itself on the territory? And the other aspect that is particularly important for me is the client, those who ask architects to design something. The client I had, the concession land, wanted to take art away from the rooms of the museums to place both art and architecture in connection with groups of people, with rural people, not in metropolitan areas, but rather in a rural environment, connecting an architect, an artist with a different human group. So there are clients who are the architect to produce something, giving a specific significance to their work. We do not start our design from a program, from measurements. We rather develop an idea that starts from a human group that creates a connection with the architect. But I also was extremely interested in human and animal architecture. Craftworks are made with the hands for men, with the beak by birds, with the secretions if we refer to other animals. There is, in any case, a certain craft aspect in this type of architecture. So we had local firms, local businesses work in this way, just to save money and resources. We should be very cautious in our use of resources. Quite often we discuss about materials, but you have to keep into account the problem of costs. Costs that can be extremely distributed. The financial cost is not the only cost we have to keep into account. We have to consider the ecological cost of a material. So the issue of economy is particularly important. We have to carry out an economic analysis, first of all, but also we have to understand the significance of a certain work. Architecture must have its own effect on the society in which it is developed. It is not just a question of sincerity of a building, but we also must consider the impact on society.
Thank you. No, this is very interesting because, ironically, coming from a completely different context, I think I actually lie in between the two positions, right? So obviously, we use a lot of, handmade solutions. We use a lot of craftsmen. We use a lot of craftsmanship and their skills in our project. It's something that's incredibly important. And it's also important because of the cultural memory that it carries, right? Because one of the issues that, any non-Western countries or territories have is kind of this danger of, in a way, having our patrimoine, kind of like wiped away, in a sense, in the pursuit of progress, in the pursuit of standardization, in the pursuit of, modernization, you name it. And so for us, the work always threads that line, right? Where is the place of, the local, the craft, the know-how, the sort of cultural riches that are there and that should be preserved, and where is the place of the, the progress while being mindful of the ecology, but most importantly also while being mindful of the economic aspect. And this is where Monsieur Berger and I also see eye to eye, in the sense that, one of the most important things that we consider, but with completely different consequence than in Monsieur Berger's case, is the economic cost and the economic weight of, the problems. But for us, the answer actually lies in this collaboration with local fabricators, because that automatically means that we do not have to import solutions from elsewhere. And it becomes an exercise of trying to produce solutions that can be made locally, that are aware of how we can harness as designers local skills in order to make something that is contemporary, that is of now, and that also projects us in the future, and in the aspirations. And then obviously, then you have that communal component, right? I completely agree that, that now architecture is going in the direction of not just being sort of an object in the landscape, but of being this true contribution to a community, true actor and agent in what happens in that community. And for us, that is something that is absolutely crucial. Once again, when you're talking about communities that are relatively vulnerable, both ecologically in our case, considering that countries that are already warm are on the front line for climate change, and all of the environmental disasters that are happening all over the world are being felt stronger in those areas, but they're also economically the most vulnerable ones, which means that they do not have the means to protect themselves from these catastrophes. So then where is the place, you know, as architects, we do have a place there somewhere, both in terms of the materials that we use, the technologies that we employ, the tactics that we deploy in order to protect, you know, ourselves, but also to protect an environment, or rather not contribute negatively to the deterioration of an environment.
Thanks a lot, Maryam. It's my turn, but I'm going to ask Roy's question again. If I can start with a few observations, what is beautifully perplexing about all of your projects is that even though you've tried to validate the work in relationship, in terms of its expressive dimension, in relationship to artisanal cultural practices, Maryam and Alexia, and in relationship to primitive habitats, whether animal or human, in the work of Patrick. And as much as you try to ground it in this kind of history of cultural expressions and the continuities of those, the work is extremely novel and almost ineffable, meaning it's very difficult to say what it says yet. After all, it was one of the ambitions of this panel in order to say what is really going to be the aesthetic of sustainability. That's what we wanted to extract from this discussion, and we chose 3 projects that have really been pushing that question quite well. Before coming here, I had a dinner with a friend who asked me, can you extract from the Biennale a particular style that is emerging or a particular aesthetic that is emerging? And I was a little bit taken aback by that question, because that's not how we thought about the exhibition. But at the same time, it forced me to think about it. What is the emerging approach here? It's probably too soon to tell, and it's probably not the right question to ask, but if we are to look at what you've presented today, there are compellingly very challenging overtures that you are really making to us to think about a new, I'm not going to call it style or aesthetic, but maybe a new disposition in relationship to architecture, which is very different than the past one. And I really, past ones, but I really commend you for how much temptation you have resisted in taking and pushing things forward, even though you're working with very traditional techniques. If I can highlight 3 aspects of the work that I find to be, again, leading this overture. One has to do perhaps with the softness in which you approach the form. That you all are producing, I would say, fuzzy edges. That the edge is not sharp, it is fuzzy. It's almost like your alpaca sweater jacket. And maybe it has to do with the material hybridity, the technological hybridity, but there's also something that is very much about the unfinished nature of every project, that it is deliberately unfinished, tentative, open to possible change, but also a condition that I think all of them have, which is the condition of porosity. And obviously that is an overture to environment, or overture to the mitigation rather than the isolation of the world from the architecture. That is actually, I think, a quality that we can extrapolate from your work and see it in the rest of the Biennale. A second quality, which I think comes back to the debate that happened just now about technology types or types of technology, has to do with the kind of deliberate, or rather precise imprecision that all 3 projects have. C'est en même temps précis et imprécis. C'est en même temps correct et incorrect. The idea that you are able to use very advanced technologies as framing the process, and I think Maryam pointed that out in your work, and you did as well. But ultimately, the technologies that you're embracing within this framework are actually local artisanal crafts-like technologies. And that speaks to the question that Patrick raised about the politics of the process of design and positioning material, monetary, labor issues in relationship to the future of architecture. And I think here again, you're pointing a direction and an overture to a very different understanding of architecture in terms of labor, craft, and the ethos of making. And I was just like, okay, I'm jumping up and down even though I'm sitting down. It's like there's something there. But I think lastly, if I can point to another quality, which I think Maryam just pointed it out at the very end, and Patrick and Alexia earlier, which has to do with the place-object relationship, and where all of you seem to say that we are no longer creating definitive objects sitting on the ground, but they are objects that make place, objects that interact with the community. Maryam used those words, and all of you used those words, in order to create something like I think Michel Serres has put it way before us, the quasi-object. An object that is only meaningful when it is engaged and connected with the community around it, rather than sitting alone. And so for all of the above, I truly don't have a question. I just have comments and reflections and really flowers to throw at you and the work that you've given us at this Biennale to make us think so, how can one say it, in a rich way about the futures of architecture. I don't know if you want to add anything, Roy or Alexia, Patrick. Maryam as well.
I think thinking in a kind of the characteristics that the architecture of the future should have, I think it's important that it has to be adaptable. It has to challenge change. It's very important because it's, in that way your engagement with the public, no? So this is really important. For us, we depart in the in situ installation, understanding the place the installation stands, not the arsenale, and its particular physical conditions of the arsenale. But then came the exhibition as well, no? That built a new geography, no? And then came the visitors. So it's because of that we really, our stance was to believe in systems, no? And bring from Lima to Venice a spatial fragment, something that is incomplete, no? Because we think that we want to point out that it's very important the role of these encounters, no? From that space, from that experience, what can happen, no? So I think it's really important the integration of the existing conditions, no? The awareness of that you have to deal with that since the beginning, no? Not in the middle or at the end. You have to deal with that there, no? And then, in the process of the installation, we also change a lot, no? But the structure, the installation, gave us the possibilities, the conditions to have a lot of changes, no? And be more integrated to different details of what is happening there in the moment, no? But it's always changing.
Oui, je voudrais juste ajouter les points suivants.
I would like to add a few words. I think that in half a century, independently of environmental change, in our minds, important events took place. First of all, the end the end of the central role for men. Starting from the 1960s, 1970s, our idea has changed. And then the fundamental change in metropolitan areas, but also the end of an anthropocentric approach. The man is no longer alone. He's immersed in the surrounding world. And this is quite a breakthrough in our way of seeing the world. And the second thing I wanted to say is that we are aware that also in this Biennale, that there are large-scale projects, but there are also very local projects. We have different scales of action. We must be able to control the scale at which we work. We lack perhaps an intermediate scale. We have cities, neighborhoods, a large scale which is quite uncontrolled. But if we want to go back to the local scale, the scale of our interventions, by the way, when we start from a local scale, this doesn't mean that we cannot shift to a larger scale, but this will take place step by step, thanks to different intercorrelation. In architecture, we speak a lot about economy. There is a productive expenditure. You build a building for a certain use. Also in architecture, we have this aspect of expenditure for a certain objective. But this type of spending is unproductive unless, and this brings me back to sustainability, unless this allows you to create a shared value, a value that is common to the whole of the community. If it is not a shared value, it is ephemeral. And from a cultural point of view, it is very difficult to obtain as compared to the human group. It is very difficult to define symbolic unproductive spending that will produce a symbol that is later on shared by different generations. I heard that the work we do is particularly important. It is well managed and well regulated. It can have a strong impact. Architecture many times was developed in order to obtain beauty. The work we are doing now is important not only for the final result, but also for the process of creation. We must be proud of what we do in order to create beauty.
Very brief, because I think some excellent points were just made about, kind of in a way, now how we live together, but also how we move forward, right? And it seems to me that also what's happening now is incredibly encouraging in the sense that architecture is starting to, or going back to seeing itself as a real agent of something, as opposed to, in a way, making, spaces or objects or structures as though they had no impact on what's around them. We can no longer pretend that the choices that we make, as designers, and the intent that we put in and what we build, in a way lives in a vacuum. It doesn't, obviously. It has massive impacts, not just for communities, but for the planet, obviously, considering how much pollution the construction industry generates. I think it's something like over 30% of the global pollution. So there is a real responsibility there, whether we choose to acknowledge it or not, whether we choose to tackle that or not. What we put out there does have those impacts. It's kind of up to us whether we're going to, tackle that head on, if we're going to take responsibility for the choices that we make, the choices that we put on the table as options in our projects. But then it also, I wonder if this is maybe the time where we start questioning sort of the 20th century and its, especially in the early 20th century, it's kind of tabula rasa, approach to everything, right? Where we, in a way, pretended that we invented everything and that progress really meant that we had to make something brand new that nobody had ever imagined before, even though we weren't really inventing that much. There was just a lot of, taking from here, taking from there, putting things together. And then in the process, we lost a lot of things that were acquired, over centuries, over millennia, in terms of ingenuity, in terms of, the wisdom with which we handle our natural environment, simple ways that we had of mitigating that environment and negotiating with that environment, because mechanization made it easy, because technology made it easy to just live in a little silo, where we don't have to be subjected to the climate. We have heat, we have air conditioning, we have all of these things. And so now we might actually not have a choice as things are going forward and becoming incredibly dire, environmentally speaking, but to start perhaps looking back at, a few things here and there that perhaps we can start reintegrating again. Wisdoms that still are relevant today. As a matter of fact, to go back to what you were talking about, Hashim, earlier in terms of hybridity, right? True hybrid systems that are not negating, advances of the past, nor are they negating the current advances, but is more of a negotiation and a kind of give or take in terms of what is really useful and what really moves us forward, not just in a dogmatic way for progress with an idea of what dogmatic idea of what progress means, but in a more common sense way, I would say. And I'm hoping that, it feels, I guess, these days that we might be inching in that direction a bit, which makes one hopeful, I think, for the future. At least it certainly makes me hopeful.
Hope is what we need. And thanks for concluding with it. I just wanted to turn to Roy to see if you had any concluding remarks, Roy.
Thanks, Hashim. Yeah, I don't know how we are of time. I also don't know if there are any questions from the audience. But very briefly, I would just mention, certainly I agree with the diagnosis here in terms of there is an interest in the hybridity of processes. There is an interest as well in the hybridity of technologies, and certainly a kind of a questioning about what happens here with the kind of boundaries, limits, relationships of the buildings, which I think is a fundamental theme throughout the Biennale. I would also like to say that there is something that I found tremendously interesting as well in the three projects and your three presentations. And it is that even if you're working in very specific buildings with quite a precise and limited scales, in all your presentations, there has been a kind of an insistence on a scale that actually is way above that of those buildings. No, this has been Patrick has shown us a kind of an aerial representation of the space where it is. Alexia, you have talked as well about the spaces between the households, etc. No? And I think that you have perfectly foregrounded how somehow architectural interventions, which can be very limited in scope, have also a strong capacity to start reformulating the broader milieus that are surrounding it. No, I actually I think that Patrick, you actually described that perfectly when you were talking about somehow the necessity to go beyond a sort of a pyramidal thinking, no, that establishes a kind of a sequence of scales. No? So that I found was really a fantastic contribution. So I stop here, and I would just like to know if there is any questions before we close, or otherwise if we call it a day. Yeah, there is one. I think There should be a micro somewhere.
Hi. Yeah, thank you for this approach as well. It's also very nice to hear a bit more about the craft and the know-how, because I think the former points or the former lecture were maybe more orientated on other parts. And I follow very actively the part on the question of economy in architecture, and especially economy versus sustainability, and how to question how do you frame the economy between the people and the craft and the material. And I believe there is a strong place for that in sustainability, of rethinking where do you put the money? Do you put the money in the people, or do you put the money in the material? And yeah, it's a bit of an open question if maybe it's something that you like to implement in your design and process of thinking it.
I think that the opportunity to design the installation give us a lot of awareness of every element of the system, no? And linked to the economics, no? I think it's super important because the installation creates some questions about the different possibilities that could be implemented in wood industry, for example, no? So I think that this is a kind of model to question it, and then from that we can learn from this awareness of each step of the process of design, no? To be very conscious. I start like saying in the presentation that we identify a major problem, no? We have a lot of illegality in the process of searching for wood and transform the wood, no? And of course, we are only using the trees to create some wood floors to import to China, United States, and other markets. So I think that we need to understand the dynamics of the forest, for example, and to try to understand the whole picture, no? And the whole picture with people, because we need to understand that forests are ecosystems that are managed daily by communities, by household members. So I think it's important to start design from that existing knowledge that is always linked to community networks, community management, of this relation, trying to create a sustainable relationship between the natural and artificial systems. So I think that in every production of a system, you need to be very conscious of that all the scales are interconnected, no? To be very, very conscious of that. And the only way is to learn working on site, no, on the field work, and to start like to be a walker and walk the places. I think that is really important, and recognize again the importance of recognizing that communities are design institutions, no, that are completely invisible in the instrument of urban planning or urbanization, no? So they have to be the main actors in the process, no?
Oui, je voudrais juste ajouter quelque chose, c'est que je crois qu'il faut être...
I would like to add one last thing. I think we should be very cautious in relation to the fact that it is not a question of going towards an ecological dogma, nor should we head towards utopia, because utopia today is an aesthetic gender in architecture. From the point of view of ideas, we should rethink everything, the passing over of traditions, competencies, craftsmanship, without making steps backwards. We should start from the status quo of things. There is a division line. We should not go beyond. Many things have happened. We should start acting from a current situation, being aware of what has been done in the past without utopically going back.
Because that is kind of the struggle, right? You know, I think there is kind of a meeting point there. It's not about, you know, that's the thing. The reverse for me is to say that there is something incredibly dangerous about denying the past for the sake of the now and of the tomorrow. There is something valuable in all of that. And that it's not to say that just because it's, you know, it relies in, it kind of belongs to a past, that it doesn't have any value. We do have things. It's not about systematically going back to the past, but it's about acknowledging what in that past still has value today and actually has the means or represents a tool that can usher us forward more productively rather than destructively. Because a lot of the forward going that we've been doing also has been destructive. And that is something that we have to acknowledge. So yes, I agree, we do have to go from today and we do have to, you know, move forward, but it is not to say that there is nothing valuable that we can appropriate from what came before. And I think just to say something real quick about what, about the question that was asked from the audience real quick, about the mix of, you know, people and economy. I think I agree with Alicia in the sense that the two can actually go together quite naturally, because at the end of the day, when you start to think about systems, construction systems, material systems in a much more localized way, then that automatically actually incorporates people. What removes people from the equation is actually when we decide that design does not have to contend with its local realities and can therefore, you know, afford itself and allow itself to import whatever it needs because it's only at its own service, right? Design for the sake of design. Then at that point, then you remove the people component automatically. But I think when you bring it back to a certain kind of awareness of what exists locally and the riches that exist locally, that automatically involves a community, that automatically involves a local know-how, that automatically, you know, merges the two together.
Maryam, thank you very much. We want to thank the panelists for a very, very enriching discussion that will stay with me for a long time, and I'm sure being online, the public will have access to it for thinking about the future. I think we need to take a break of 5 minutes to reconvene with the last panel of this conference. Maryam, thank you so much. Patrick,
thank you,
Alessia, thank
everyone.
You. Roy, thanks.
Are we there already? We can start. Hello? We start? Fantastic. So, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us. We are now starting the last panel of our symposium on dimensions of sustainability. It's a conversation that will focus on a series of projects that we have in the Giardini in the cross-border section, all of them dealing with the idea of global commons and the role that these spaces have for addressing some of the most relevant questions regarding ecology and climate, spaces that are as well particularly contentious and difficult. Our panelists today are going to be like Giulia Foscari, Gringo Cardia, and Territorial Agency. We have with us on the stage Giulia and Gringo and Anne-Sophie and John from Territorial Agency will join remotely. So let me briefly introduce them. Giulia Foscari is an architect, researcher, and writer who has been practicing in Europe, Asia, and the Americas. She is the founder of UNA, an architecture studio based in Hamburg and Venice, and of its alter ego, Unless, a non-profit agency for change. Foscari's past work experience includes a long-term collaboration with Ren Koolhaas, which started in Hong Kong and led her to run OMA's South American platform. Her architecture studio, UNA, focuses on cultural projects, among them the Anish Kapoor Foundation in Venice, which is now under construction. Giulia is a member of the International Council of the Museum of Modern Art, New York. Her work was exhibited in multiple editions of the International Architecture Exhibition of La Biennale di Venezia. She taught for 5 years design studio at Hong Kong University and at the Architectural Association, where she ran a diploma unit and founded the Polar Lab, which is strongly connected to the exhibition that we have here. Giulia authored Elements of Venice and is the editor of Antarctic Resolution, which was recently awarded the Montauban Group Golden Medal and the Frankfurt Book Fair Dam Award for Best Architectural Publication of the Year. Gringo Cardia, our following speaker, is a designer, architect, scenographer, and museum and exhibition curator. He is the founder of the social youth project Espectáculo School of Art and Technology in Rio de Janeiro. A Casa Gringo Cardia design studio is a team of architects, scenographers, musicians, editors, animators, designers, and iconographic researchers based in Rio and led by Gringo and his sister Gringa Cardia. Finally, Territorial Agency is an independent organization established by architects and urbanists John Palmesino and Anne-Sophie Ronskog. Territorial Agency combines contemporary architecture, art, spatial analysis, remote sensing, advocacy, and action to promote comprehensive territorial transformations. Their work focuses on the integration of science, architecture, and art in the challenges posed by climate change. The conversation will be moderated by me and by Hashim, and I give the word to our first speaker, Giulia. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Roy, for the introduction. Thank you, Hashim, for the invitation to be here and the invitation to Unless to contribute to how we live together. I think it is very relevant to have this conversation here on the Global Commons just a few days after the closing of COP26, the climate summit, which took place in Glasgow, and which, as you all know, has only barely managed to keep alive the target of the 1.5 degrees Celsius. If you allow me, I would like to sort of start this contribution by sharing a short clip from David Attenborough's opening statement at COP26. There should be the audio. There is no audio.
The stability we all depend on is breaking. This story is one of inequality, as well as instability.
Well, we missed part of the audio, but I believe as architects we have a responsibility to use our disciplinary knowledge to heighten awareness on urgent matters such as that of the climate crises. I don't think we can stand here and have an intellectual conversation and listen to a 93-year-old man through whom we were able to see the world and all the corners and its wonders virtually, calling for action, or a young 19-year-old who is demonstrating against sort of political blah, 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 and do nothing as architects. As a Venetian, I've been highly sensitized to the notion of high-level waters and sea level rise. And as an architect, although I am sort of busy generally on cultural projects, I have decided to proactively take action and advocate for climate action, but through the tools of the architectural discipline. And this has led me to launch a international, in fact transnational, collective and multidisciplinary project on Antarctica, and to Find Unless, which is a non-profit agency for change devoted to research on extreme territories which are at peril due to the climate crises. Why Antarctica? Antarctica accounts for 10% of the planet Earth's landmass. The ice which covers its bedrock, which has stratified for a million of years. Sorry, this is just not working. Sorry, the slide's not, yeah, there we go. Accounts for 90% of the ice of planet Earth and 70% of the fresh water. This ice is the largest repository of data on climate change. Through an analysis of ice cores such as this one here, photographed by Spencer Lowell, and which was drilled at 3 kilometers depth in the ice of Antarctica, one can analyze the air bubbles which are contained therein or captive, such as sort of time capsules which allow to draw the trend line which David Attenborough was talking about in his presentation. I'm sorry, there's somehow a delay effect. Which you can see here, where you can see the trend between the carbon dioxide in the past 800,000 years through cycles of glacial and interglacial eras, as well as that of the temperature. And also understand the peak of the 414 parts per million of carbon dioxide we have today since industrialization, which, as he rightfully says, is not only a history of instability, but also one of inequality. But Antarctica is not only the repository of data on climate history, but it's also the largest menace to all the coastal communities around the world. It's melting, which is occurring 6 times faster than it was only 40 years ago. And it's not only occurring due to the melting of the ice from above, from the sort of warmer atmosphere, but also from the carving effect of warmer ocean waters, which are carving the ice shelf from below and releasing huge icebergs, such as this one here you see, which is the size of Manhattan, just to give you the idea, and which can no longer buttress and act as a brake to the glaciers which relentlessly move towards the ocean. So if all of Antarctica should melt, which is an apocalyptic scenario we're not expecting, but should it, the inundation and the increase of sea level would be of 60 meters, launching the largest migration ever witnessed by humankind. But the waters that revolve around Antarctica, which I'm sure John and Anne-Sophie will speak about later perhaps, are also really important because they ignite the whole thermoline circulation, which is basically also known as the ocean's conveyor belt, mixing the waters of the whole world. But it is interesting that it's the largest carbon sink on our planet, because the waters which are south of the 35th parallel, which is the Southern Ocean, in fact, uptake more carbon dioxide than all the other oceans due to a number of reasons I will not expand on here. So it is vital, and it provides an incredible service to our planet. In doing so, obviously, the waters are there's an acidification process, which is no longer allowing coccolithophores, which were just passed briefly in the slides, to calcify, but is also putting in peril many species which are in the waters of Antarctica and in the oceans in general, and producing a very serious biodiversity loss. I'm sorry again, which was mapped here in this cartography. So Antarctica really is a factory of the climate of the world. I love this image from an old Argentine propaganda bulletin, but it really is that. And it is surprising that it wasn't addressed more seriously at COP26. especially considering that discoveries made in Antarctica, such as the discovery of the ozone hole, have led to the signing of important protocols, such as the Protocol of Montreal, which banned the use of ozone-depleting substances. So what we tried to do in the exhibition at the Central Pavilion of Antarctic Resolution, and when I say we, I mean not only the wonderful team of UNLES and the Polar Lab that you referred to, which is the academic platform of UNLES, but also the 150 leading world experts who have contributed to this research from the fields of science, geopolitics, architecture, and habitation. We have tried collectively to produce the first encyclopedic research on Antarctica, which had a twofold ambition. The project is called Antarctic Resolution, and the first ambition is that of creating a high-resolution image of a continent that was discovered in 1820, so almost exactly 200 years ago, which in our conscience, however, remains a thin line which borders the Gall-Peters projection of the world. And if you look in Google Maps or Google Earth, which we surely always do, if you zoom into the continent, you only have a pixelated image of that realm. So the idea was that of creating, as I said, a high-resolution image. Sorry, this is just not moving. But also of launching an Antarctic resolution. So a resolution that strengthens and ideally extends in time the Madrid Protocol, which was signed in 1991 to ban any mineral extraction from the continent of Antarctica. As you might know, under the ice sheet that covers the continent, the bedrock is full of mineral resource, and that we know from Geological Association. But the protocol does not account for a reduction or a control of bioprospecting, or tourism, which are both phenomena which are increasing dramatically. Neither does it really control the fishing activities which occur in the Antarctic waters, which primarily are referred to krills, which are very small crustaceans which are abundant in those waters. This is a krill, and which are essential in the food chain and are very often used just for the omega-3 and other products, and that is why they are so interesting for commercial use. What the Madrid Protocol also doesn't account for is the protection of marine protected areas. There are on the table a number of proposals to be able to reach the target of 30 by 30, of protecting 30% of the oceans by 2030. But again, just 2 weeks ago, China and Russia, unfortunately, have refused and rejected for the 8th time the proposal to create marine protected areas. So we were actually invited with UNLES to present the body of research we produced for the Biennale, also at the 30th anniversary of the Madrid Protocol, where there were a number of delegates of 33 nations who then all went to Glasgow. And we had the opportunity to discuss this at a higher level, and we're committed with UNLES to try to use this project to contribute to an Antarctic resolution. But a resolution which also affects our discipline, because we believe that it's important to reduce the anthropic footprint on the continent. Here you can see physically the first footprints of the explorers who in the heroic age crossed the path of a penguin highway, as captured by Herbert Ponting, or more recently by a photographer called Anne Noble, who has depicted that through a photographic portfolio on piss poles. But our presence in Antarctica has grown throughout time, and at present it accounts for approximately 4,300 transient citizens that live in Antarctica during the summer season, the austral summer season. And these citizens live in stations which are not always individual buildings which somehow punctuate the continent as we believe, but they're proper cities, such as this one here of McMurdo, which is the American hub, which comprises of 116 buildings and hosts approximately 1,000 people. And construction in Antarctica has by now occupied a footprint of 400,000 square meters, approximately, and a building practice that operates without building regulation. I'm sorry, this is just not reacting. You can see here some blasting for the construction of the station on Antarctica, and followed by fuel bladders, which are necessary to fuel the continent, to fuel the stations which are located on the continent. I'm terribly sorry. This is the fuel bladder. But there are rare occasions in which there are stations which are in fact sustainable. This is Princess Elizabeth, of which we actually have exhibited one panel, 1-to-1, in the Future Assembly exhibition in the Biennale. But generally speaking, the stations are by definition contaminating, especially because they anyway sink relentlessly in the ice. The image which should follow is one of Buckminster Fuller's dome, geodesic dome, which was built on South Pole as the American station, and which has sunk in the ice and moved with the ice shelf towards the ocean, calving into the waters. I'm not quite sure. No. That was Buckminster Fuller. Here is the architecture appearing on the ice barrier and to then fall into the ocean, as you can see here. So what we did with NLS is to create the first census of all architectures ever constructed on the continent. On the one hand, to trace a somehow accelerated history, a typological history of Antarctic architectures, from huts which are reminiscent of somehow sort of Vitruvian huts, all the way to more contemporary buildings, such as the one built by Hugh Broughton, which will follow, which was reminiscent of provocation from the 1960s. But the effort of producing the first archive of architectures, this was here, I'm sorry, there's a time lapse, which you can see here, has led us to another understanding which is very important to us, which is that only 1 out of 9 of the occupants of these stations is a scientist, and only 13.8% of the surface area of these stations is occupied in average by scientific labs. Here you can see the diagrams which sort of analyze the various stations and come to this conclusion, which in our opinion is something we should really reflect upon. Because if it is true that we are in Antarctica for the scope of conducting scientific research for the benefit of humanity as a whole, then we should have shared infrastructure as we have in space through International Space Station, whilst all the stations in Antarctica are national and not shared, except for one, which is Concordia, which is Italo-French. So what we have tried to do with NLS, advocating for a reduction of the footprint, but also for a greater collaboration of shared infrastructure and eventually shared data, was to operate at a micro scale, that of a portable environment. Because in Antarctica, as in space, you could claim that the first architecture is that of the clothing. Temperatures in Antarctica reach minus 89 degrees, and survival is uncertain. So we have invited the DR Lab to design a suit, which was exhibited again in the exhibition, which could allow to take bodily temperature and to be able to heat the body at the right temperature, but also send data to the station to inform on a potential hypothermia of a scientist which is on the field, but to allow the scientist to be outside of the building for a greater amount than the current 10 minutes of autonomy they have in the winter. And therefore, once again, to try to optimize the possibility of conducting science in the winter as well, in safety. The suit, which will now follow, was exhibited in the Biennale, but we're very happy that it was also, and proud, that it has been already tested in Antarctica in the past season by the Italian team operating in Concordia Station, and the beta version will be tested as of next month from the French and the Italian, which for us is a small victory, and again, in trying to claim on the necessity of sharing infrastructure, or micro-architecture, as we could claim this clothing stands for. So ultimately, with Antarctic Resolution, we're really looking at Antarctica as a global commons, such as the high seas and the atmosphere and space, and really trying to reject an understanding of Antarctica as the possibility of a national claim on the continent, as it was done historically by 12 nations, where you could see some of the geometry of power of that sort of sector map which we saw, and also go beyond what was signed in 1959 during the Cold War through the Antarctic Treaty, which has banned military action on the continent and nuclear power plants or experimentation, but to ensure that a continent which is a global commons is not in the hands of just 8% of the nations, and not even in the hands or managed by just 15% of the nations, which currently have veto rights and vote on the management of Antarctica, even though they represent 80% of the GDP, but to ensure that the governance of Antarctica is really managed equitably in the benefit of humanity as a whole. And this is what we try to advocate for and less, and this is the best manifestation of how this project for us is really a call for action, besides being an architectural collective body of research, was presented in the exhibition or embodied in the exhibition by the work of Arcangelo Sassolino, who's an Italian artist, developed in collaboration with David Vaughan, who is the lead scientist for the Thwaites Collaboration Project, a glaciologist, head of the British Antarctic Survey, who have jointly recreated the sound of the ice breaking in Antarctica, which is alarming, it's scary. I had the honor of hearing it, and we thought it would be important to bring it in the Biennale as a, again, call for action, which hopefully can bring greater attention to the importance of Antarctica in the global ecosystem. And if I may, I'll let a very short clip where one can hear the installation at work. If it goes. Thank you.
The next speaker is Gringo Cardia. I don't know if everything's ready for him to join us. Yes. Hi, Gringo.
Hi. Hi. Nice to meet you, Rasheen, Roy, and everybody. For me, it's a pleasure to be with you here in this conference and talk a bit about our installation, the installation I did with you in the Biennale. And our installation talks about philosophy, art, and architecture in a way that we can translate it by feelings with Takuman Kuikuru, that is a cinematographer that I work with, and also a project of philosophy and social that is the People's Palace project from London. And we did this installation called Oka Red, that is, Oka is like the house, is talk about house, life, and urgency. That's something that we are facing in Brazil, in our forests, with the original inhabitants, and also it's similar happening all over the world. And so how we learn with the original inhabitants of our country that still lives in harmony together with the surroundings. We think this is very important and a way of inspiring all the work we do in the cities, all over, in the architecture, in urbanism, but looking at them and what they do with the ancestral philosophy of living together that are very strong. In Brazil now, we are facing a very the most strong attack that the forces of predatory development, with the help of the government we have now in Brazil, is going against these people. So it's a sample of what's happening all over the world, I think. In the times that still remains the idea that the product is more important than the man itself, and the more important thing that the production needs all the time is more products in less time. So this is how the people wanted to attack all the time the nature here in Brazil. The philosophy of living well that comes from our indigenous tribes have the essential connection with the common life in the community as a big family. The family that includes the surroundings and the environment. And so for us, this is a model of living together and the reciprocity to live together with the environment, the nature. And so the man and and the environment in the daily life are like one organism. We think this is essential thing that the humanity has to learn with the indigenous people. It's complementary, share, not compete. And use the technology of indigenous architecture and urbanism territory. They live in a big house shared with sometimes with many people of the same family and sometimes with the different families. But this big house we call Oca. And this is all done with the materials from nature, and they have a special cosmic spatiality that integrates all of these houses into a small cell that is attached to the forest surrounding. And we don't pay attention how much we can learn with these indigenous people, how they live together. We are lucky that we still have these original people living here together in Brazil to teach us that. And I think the way that all the things here are shared between the community is something that our society doesn't understand because of the individual principles. And this is, for me, is the main principle and the inspiration of the learning. In the society of the indigenous, they share everything. Everything is not individual, is for the common of the community. And in our society, the well-succeeded are the ones that accumulated. In the Quicuru village of the Xingu in Amazonia, this doesn't exist, the culture of accumulation, of something, everything is shared. So this is very nice for inspiration as we look at them as an architect and an artist, and how we can bring these essential things that are for many years with them to our daily conception of cities and architecture. And what also is very important is the cosmic vision that indigenous architecture has to be connected with the environment as a part of the body of the forest. So the body of the village is integrated with this surrounding. Even architecture is more planned to be a part of all. We learned from them also the respect of collecting the materials to do the architecture. That is something that is not all the time. They have the special times to collect the materials, and the architecture is more sealed than construct. It's like to do a fabric. They do their houses. It's like the men, they use more the hands to do that. So this symbiosis between anthropology and architecture and with art, we inspired our day life. And the day life of the community also have a different value of time. In the Quicuru village, they celebrate the time and the nature every day like a ritual. And we think that this is something that is vital for sustainability, to give value and time to things that surround us. I think in our society, we cannot consider the other men as friends because they are potential competitors. So we cannot accept them to like that. We have to be the winner. In the society of the indigenous, the Quicuru, they didn't even don't understand that because they are only one thing and one family. And this is how we think that is inspiring, because it's something that in our conception lacks a lot in architecture, in the urbanism, this kind of sense. And we don't live in a society of collaboration, but in a competition. And so this is how we inspired in them how we live together. And we learned from Oca Red. With that, we made that with Takuman Kuikuru, with his sensibility. He showed us images of this daily life of the village and how it's possible and simple to do that, living together in the nature in between them. And this was possible because we made this project because we had an art residence that we did together with the People's Palace project, so that could bring the ideas of sustainability and respect to put together architects, artists and indigenous, so that we can just make some artwork, so that we can, with the artwork, understand more about the philosophy, that it's essential to understand our times and how we can change that. So I think in Brazil, we have the chance to have the indigenous and learn with them the happiness of the beauty, because the essential things like for the indigenous people is the beauty, that is all the world is more equilibrated when the beauty is there, when they have the beauty in their bodies, when they copy the nature and doing the paintings on their bodies and doing all the ornaments that they have, the house and the design of that are very simple but very organic. In a way, this inspired a lot, like the nature, to be like that in our way, our conception of life. Yeah, and we think that this is very important to present now, because we are facing here in Brazil this strongest fight to destroy the forest. And in a way, we think that all this big question of the climate change and everything is attached in the way that we integrated with the surroundings. Because in the indigenous is the forest, but in the cities like we live, it's the same relation, but it's the same with the surrounding. And so this is Oca Red, and this is what we wanted to bring to everybody, is this sensation of inspiration of the philosophy of the indigenous. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gringo. Muito obrigado. Maybe we can pass now to John and Sophie, if they are ready. Okay, John, is it only you?
Unfortunately.
Okay, that's fine. That's good enough. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Roy, and buonasera, Julia, and hello, Ashim. It's very nice to be, at least virtually, in Venice. It's where the project I'm going to discuss really started, and we were inspired also a few years back from fantastic conversation that we had with a number of scientists, and Hashim joined us in a very heated roundtable debate. Today, we see really from Julia's work, from the amazing and inspiring work of Gringo, how architecture is becoming more and more engaged with advocacy. At Territorial Agency, we would like today to share with you one aspect of this, one aspect of our work that has been developed in collaboration with the Biennale of Ashim and Roy and all the group, fantastic group of people around it. And it's what we call the sensible zone. And I'm going to share screen and sound with you, and I'll guide you through some of the work. The Sensible zone is a new zone of the ocean. It's a new zone of the ocean. It's not only the upper part of the ocean, but it's the new zone that includes the areas that are going to be covered by water in case of when the major sea level rise will occur. But before we describe the sensible zone, I would like you to start with a very simple question, and that is really the condition through which we start understanding the relationship between architecture, construction, and the planetary. A simple question: how heavy is a city that has multiple and unusual ways of being answered? The city, or what we still think of the city as a compact environment, somehow opposed to the large expanses of forest, of the ice of Antarctica, or the larger agricultural area, is now transformed into a new paradigm of the Earth. It is covering completely the processes and cycles of the Earth. The processes and cycles of the Earth are really the core element of science when we are dealing with the contemporary life on the planet. And they basically relate to the thermal and biological and physical exchanges between the atmosphere, the land, and the ocean. That means the strata that is somehow inhabited by life. What we are dealing with when we're talking about the city being expanded so much is really the intrusion into that Earth system of a new figure, which is a new structure that metabolizes fossil fuels. It is what has engulfed the city. It has transformed humans from a species that were really distributed equitably in all parts of temperate lands, and it has now become a figure that is intruding on the planet. It's what really marks the epoch of the Anthropocene. From within, the technosphere, which is the name of this new figure, seems like the extension of the city, extension of design identity, infrastructures, very complex systems of measurement, plantations. The technosphere is really formed by everything that we, first of all, by humans, everything that we eat, in the sense that plantations and domesticated animals and plants, and all the catches from the oceans, and the material and energy fluxes that sustain. From within, we think we can interact with it through design. And this is really the condition where architects interact the best. The proposition for the sensible zone that we have presented at the Biennale is to consider the interaction between the technosphere and the land and the ocean only in this most sensitive component, between -200 meters, where water is still, where light can still reach into the darkness of the waters and activate photosynthesis, and where at 200 meters, we still have the majority of human activities. The difficulty of the sensible zone is that it is, from within, as I said, an extension of design. And we think that we can activate it and reform it through design, and that this gigantic mass, which is in a first time assimilated around 30 trillion tons, which is the equivalent of all land biomass. The problem is that it's a self-organizing, quasi-autonomous system, that it's almost
John, I think we lost you. I don't know if you hear us.
The abyss of the oceans with the dry land.
John, we lost you for, I don't know, 1 minute or something like that.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no problem. Maybe
can you hear me now?
We do, yeah. Maybe if you recap just like 1 minute.
So the sensible zone. So the difficulty in thinking the sensible zone is that the technosphere is that part of the world. The technosphere from within appears as an extension of designed world. From the outset, on the contrary, is a quasi articulate our life out of technology. Technology doesn't support us. On the contrary, we have turned in technology. The technological structures of our life. The technosphere in land and ocean in this sensitive, most fragile, but it's also the area that has been transformed most deeply by technology, by extraction, by the organization of the very complex structures of extraction of contemporary capitalism, in particular logistical capitalism. So the proposition of territorial agency is to focus between what is beneath the water and what is above the water. And the difficulty in thinking this is, of course, that we are not used to see the relationship to the ocean. And Julia mentioned the difficulties in thinking the thermaline circulations. And what we're not used to even imagine is the complexity of the impact of the transformation of the ocean on land. So the sensible zone that we are proposing to focus on is really this area that is far smaller, and that reveals in a more intense way the complex interactive dynamics between what is produced by humans, what is interacting with humans, and life on the planet. It is the location of the majority of critical infrastructure. It is comprising of all the megalopolis that have been formed during the last 30 years. And it is the site of the most difficult relationship between water drainage, life in the ocean, and the thriving of life on land. For instance, in this image, you see the megalopolis around Shanghai. And we've heard a few times in the last 2 days how the impact of COP is affecting already the discussion on sustainability. COP basically is a gigantic failure, but one thing that remains is 1.5 degrees. If we are all good boys and girls, and we do try to meet them, even then, there will be enough locked-in energy to transform areas that are now inhabited by more than 1 billion people into areas that are underwater. And this is really the call for action, the advocacy of the sensible zone, and to think that what we've done in the last 30 years, the rapid urbanization, something that we thought we were in control of. And suddenly when we start realizing that the entities that we've deployed into the world, like cities, architecture, infrastructures, but also structures of bureaucracies, citizenship elements, the complex making of finance, information flows, and of course the extraction of oil, is now organizing itself. Except that differently from all the other paradigms of the Earth, it's a structure that does not recycle itself. It's leaving behind it a gigantic debris of rubble, of architecture, of infrastructures, of extinctions, but mainly a gigantic debris in the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide and in the depths of the ocean in the expansion of the thermal capacity. And because we are in Venice, albeit virtually, I wanted to indicate that the conditions through which even Venice has faced the difficult notions of sea level rise are remarkable. Everybody is in awe of the difficult way in which the only infrastructure that can think itself as in relationship to sea level rise that has been produced throughout the world, protection of the lagoon, even in Venice, that is not going to be enough. This is in black the areas that are going to be covered by sea level rise the coming century, when we would be meeting the minimum target of 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees. If we don't manage that, Julia has already indicated we'll have catastrophic 60 meters transformation of the coast. Venice is remarkable in that, but it's also clear that it's not remarkable in the way it has organized its relationship to the coast, and in particular to its lagoon. But on the long term, Venice could be the only model that we have as architects to think the complex relationship to sea level rise that are coming towards us. So if in the last 30 years we've completely transformed the urban structures, in the next 30 years we have to focus on the relationship to reinvent those very same areas that we've rapidly urbanized by creating new polities that can resist and that can survive over a long period of time by modifying their own environments. And I finish with an image of San Lorenzo in Venice, where during the first lockdown of the pandemic, we lit a light on the facade. This is ocean space in Venice, indicating the dramatic level in which we have agreed and we are striving to reach sea level rise in the coming century. If we will be able to meet the Paris Agreement in the coming century, the water will be at the level of that light. So this is the Sensible Zone project, which is a spin-off of Oceans in Transformation. Attenborough meets our contemporary project commissioned to us. And I wanted to thank you all for listening to this presentation of Sensible Zone, how to focus over the coming 30 years the decarbonization processes of our societies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you in general, like Gringo and Julia. Hashim, do you want to start in this occasion? Do you want to?
Thank you, Roy. Are you hearing? Yeah. We heard 3 presentations from 3 participants in this Biennale in the section on the global commons, in the section of the 5 scales called Across Borders. And the presentations are fascinating in and of themselves, but they do enter into a dimension of questioning not just where we're going with respect to our practices in relationship to the environment, but also they open up a whole set of questions about the agency of the architect when it comes to the scale that is beyond the acknowledged scale of building or urban design that have been the conventional scales for architecture and for the Biennale as well. This is truly the first time that the Biennale has gone to a territorial scale that is transcontinental and also to the scale of the planet on one end and to the scale of the human body on the other. And what I find fascinating about all 3 projects is that you do span across the different scales in order to be able to address the transcontinental or the question of the global commons. I guess my question comes back to not so much is this architecture, forget about that, but what tools does the architect bring to the table as a first question, whether we are still able, given the scale of the table and range of expertise, you showed how even the scientist is only 1/9 of the people around the table. Is the architect still able to be the custodian of the project, the way we are conventionally at the scale of the architectural project or urban project? And thirdly, perhaps, given that these are the kinds of problems that we will be addressing and facing in the future, what other skills we might need to bring? So my questions are, what skills does the architect bring that are indispensable to be able to address this problem? are we able to be custodians at the table, or are we just one representative among others that might need to be themselves custodians? And thirdly, what skill sets do we need to equip our students or our profession in order to be able to be ready for these projects?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's interesting that you're addressing the issue of scale and scope of an architect. Now, if we go back to the good old manual for Spaceship Earth by Buckminster Fuller, and understanding that it's important to have a comprehensive view and not just where specialization might have not helped us to really understand the bigger picture. And I think that it's important to go back to address that larger scale as well as part of the scope of architecture. What skills do we bring to the table? For sure, the ability to also visualize things, to how John would say democratize knowledge, I suppose, but to disseminate otherwise knowledge. I have been working very closely with scientists and experts on geopolitics on this project for the course of the 2-3 years that we've worked on it. And it was really important for me, the notion of being able to translate and make comprehensible aspects, which took me perhaps, reading 5 books to be able to even sort of digest and then be able to translate, to visualize. So the importance of translating data and knowledge and be able to communicate those, I think we as architects have a particular skill set that allow us to contribute in such way. Whether we're custodians, I don't think so. I think we are for sure an important element around the table, as you put it. I think we cannot address a global scale issue, and we can have the presumption of being able to be custodians or master planning at such scale. I believe collaborative effort is what we need. Multidisciplinary efforts, I believe, is what is necessary to have different knowledges, and only that way can we tackle some of the challenges that we are facing. So the third aspect, new skill sets. Well, I guess it's also a matter of literacy, of what are we reading? What are we asked? What should we tell our students to read? We tend to, in all the faculties I've been either studying or teaching in, to choose a set of bibliography, which is, again, disciplinary. It's architectural. It can be at different scales, but ultimately is somewhat formal. I think that we should encourage them to read about science. We should encourage them to read geopolitics, because none of this, unfortunately, can operate without the realm of politics. I agree with John, COP was a failure. But unfortunately, we have to engage at that level as well to be able to address, resolve, hopefully reach some of the targets we have set ourselves, which, as John showed with a simple neon line, is in itself already quite haunting. So I think broadening the scope of our knowledge, again, going back perhaps to Buckminster Fuller, is an advice I would give to students.
John or Gringo, do you want to follow that?
Yes, for me, I think the idea of scale it's nice when you understand, when you talk about the indigenous communities, and you understand about the size of a cell. That sometimes when you talk about as an architect of big cities and everything, we don't understand how the original communities, they related with the cell itself, a small cell. So this is very nice, I think, for me, the discussion to have into that simple way of existence that are inspiring things that we can understand the big solutions for the city and for all the world of urbanism and architecture. And I think we have to understand that in a way that this can collaborate with us. And also these new scales, I think I agree that the new generations are very important for that, to understand how these things that seems not with many values to them, to understand the philosophy of that, the philosophy of the interactivity between the man and the environment that is very important for us and for the new generations that lives in the city. They don't even understand that because they don't have a view for that. And I think this is how it's very precious to have indigenous culture into living together, living in small communities, but in a way interacting with them a lot. And this is the way that I think we can have this dissimulated into the new generations. Yeah, I think it's very important for us that this brings in our fight as an artist and architect in Brazil is to bring that to a wider vision that everybody seems that simple is very important for us to understand the big solutions for the future.
Ashim, you ask about the table of negotiations. I think that the incredible capacity of architecture, apart from the fact that we're never really at the table. Architecture has been dismissed by many as really one of the most irrelevant knowledges. But the capacity of architecture might be that of convening the table. And you mention throughout your publications and your intellectual life, Ashim, the notion of the spatial contract to be added to the social contract. The social contract, of course, is the way in which in the 17th century Thomas Hobbes thought of the city in a moment of deep turmoil where nobody was agreeing with anybody else about truth. And in order to reconstitute truth, he invented the Leviathan, the body politic, as opposed to the state of nature, which was the space where everybody was in war against each other and all against all. I think we are back in that situation where we disagree on everything. And I think that architecture might have to reinvent both the body politic and the spatial focus. Your spatial contract might be a way in which we can guide the realignment and the reorganization of our body politic. The body politic maybe without a body politic without any notions of centrality or unification. So in answer to your three questions, I think that architecture in its millenary tradition still has the capacity of building spaces of cohabitation and I maybe even like to say of conviviality. It has specific capacity of articulating space, which is super important because let's remember that none of our assemblies, none of our political assemblies has images. We only have words. Not only we don't have images, but we don't have spatial images. And the most important thing, I think, is really the capacity of convening. And in that sense, I think that we need to all strive to establish new spaces of negotiation, new tables, new spaces where the logics need to be redefined in common, so that nobody comes with a preconceived notion of what is to be attained. We live in catastrophic times and we need to reinvent everything.
Yeah, many thanks, the three of you. Actually, I mean, I'm going to follow up on some of the things that you have said, but actually, I would like to recap of some, maybe like with Hashim's first question in a way, or with first observation about like the specificity as well of this scale and the three projects that you represent in the Biennale. No? And the fact that it is true that maybe it's one of the sections that has been more interrogated, has been something that is like more extraneous, more alien to what the conventional practices of architecture are. You know? So one of the things that for me has been very interesting through the conversation is to see so clearly how actually close to architectural practice dealing with scale or with unconventional scales is, no? And how strongly we can see like connections to something that then really can operate at other scales, no? So I've seen like three clear aspects that I can think we can all learn from. So one of them, I would say, has to deal with what to learn and what we are learning and how to translate that potential learning to other spaces of action. And I think that Gringo has actually like explained us like this super well in the case of Amazonia, no? And how actually like to engage there to see what is happening more profoundly is also like a way for us to actually rethink strongly what we think architecture is, what we think a city is, what relations we can maintain with environment, and so on. The second, certainly, I would say, is an aspect that you have mentioned, Julia, you have mentioned as well, like John, which has to do with what do we see, you know, and what we're able like to actually like visualize and show and make clear through that process of visualization. And I would say that the third one has to do with who is there, no? As a kind of a very precise question that actually brings the question of the global commons to something that is as well very specific, no? And having to do very precisely with those that can actually like be affected, no? Or that can intervene in the process of somehow like constructing these global commons, no? So from that point of view, maybe I mean, if I have to not only do a reflection, but also like have a question, that's maybe like the aspect that I would like you like to elaborate a little bit more precisely, no? So for instance, like Julia has talked about the 30 by 30 like initiative, no? So somehow like there is like this idea of there is the potential of having like a global initiative that will protect 30% of the ocean's surface, so that somehow it's like taken away from extractive processes and so on, no? But this operates at the level of, certain like a global agenda, no? I think that what is important, or what your presentations has shown us as well, is that there are like specific agents or specific actors in those areas that you are like considering, who have as well like a voice and have like the capacity to also like push in certain directions, no? So I would, like be there like who is like actually living in Amazonia, indigenous, be there like the actual biological life that there can exist like in Antarctica, or the very interests of the scientific community, and certainly those affected very strongly by sea level rise, no? As you have told us, like John. So what for me would be interesting now to know, maybe like more precisely, is how you are thinking about like somehow like these relationships between a kind of a more ambitious like global agenda and the possibilities of you as architects enabling, helping, collaborating with those agents that can be on the ground.
Well, it's a very interesting question. It's one we are posing ourselves as well, because we want to pursue this project further. And on the one hand, we have perhaps managed at this stage to offer an understanding of the actors, as you say, human and non-human, operating in Antarctica, and the potential of Antarctica being as a repository and a menace and so forth. But these are, and the various targets you referred to, the 30 by 30 and so forth, are obviously at a level that are difficult to address specifically then as an architect. But this is where I think, in our case at least, the analysis on all the buildings that we have done, which was really systematic and not at all easy, because in fact most of these stations are considered state secret, because this is where the agency of architecture becomes highly political. These buildings there are in fact embassies for the nations who want to retain a territorial footprint, to not say claim, on the continent. There is no reason for accumulation of buildings, which often are in such proximity that there really is no reasoning even in scientific realms to be present in the same peninsula. They operate in a very interesting, almost international city, or multinational city, where however then in each station they live on a different time zone, so it's quite abstract and schizophrenic. But this proliferations of stations is only linked to a political agenda, or very much so. So what we are trying to do as architects, and that's where we have a voice at the table which is more specific, is to try to analyze the data of the architecture, so to do it in a more scientific and rigorous manner than we would if we're just looking at it in terms of tectonics or materials, and all aspects which are very interesting, because habitation in an extreme environment is per se an interesting topic to analyze, and its relationship with space. That's why Antarctica is often called a space analog and so forth. So one could sort of dwell in that sort of strand of research, but we're trying to look at it also quite scientifically, to be able to then come to the tables of the COP or of the Madrid Protocol to say, architecture is used as a political device and not as an enabler for science. So where we could try to advocate for, but with some knowledge to bring to the table, is how can we make sure there could be building standards in Antarctica, because there's none and they were contaminating more than we could. How can we make sure, because the biggest sustainable action there is to condense, is to just have international stations, and these have the wonderful side effect of enabling and forcing actual collaboration between the nations, and therefore sharing of the data which is extracted, because at the moment they all go in data rooms around the world and they're not necessarily shared either, because there's also commercial sides to the research, which could be bioprospecting and so forth. So as an architect, we're hoping that we can contribute to the discourse in a more specific manner by continuing a research on the stations and trying to bring forward a proposal for only international stations being built there, and for a much more conscious way of operating there than the one we're doing at present. So we're hoping to operate at both scales. On one hand, still the macro, the comprehensive scale, where we want to create awareness, where we want to side and support advocacy projects which are running and which are dealt with from people who have the disciplinary knowledge to do so in a more accurate manner, be it a marine specialist in the case of marine protected areas or what have you, but also to contribute as an architect in what has been completely overlooked, i.e. 200 years of inhabitation history in such an extreme environment.
Yeah. For me, I think what's important to bring this idea of the indigenous is that the people don't think only that is about the indigenous, but we are talking about the last forest of the planet, that is Amazon. The Amazon is the only, the last big forest with the major diversity of life, that is essential for the science, a lot of things that we need in our life, and also I think the way that we understand with the architecture as an architects is that how we can help the people to understand that there is a possibility to live protecting this forest, and at the same time have a kind of development that is essential for the humanity. We have the last part of all the globe is here in Brazil, is in Amazonia, that has this richness of things. And I think what we can learn with the architecture of the indigenous is that how they can live together with that, and how they can be a part of the nature, and at the same time protect, and at the same time can do things that are essential for all the humanity. And I think what we are facing in Brazil is a devastating destruction very quickly of the forest. In the last 5 years, it's almost 10 times more than the last year. And then this is very important to bring this to a discussion, of a worldwide discussion, to protect this big area, because it's not of Brazil, but it's for the humanity. And I think the indigenous, and they are like, how can I say, teach us how to live together with that, and how this would help everybody to be together, because this affects the climate. A lot of things that we think in Brazil, we are changing the climate here is together with the destruction of the forest. And so in a way, I think as an architect here, we have to try to bring this as much as we can for every world feels this like, essential for themselves. It's not because you are from far from here that it's not important. So it's very much important that we have to join the forces to protect that. And I think this is how we can, as everything we do, we try to bring this to the table so that the people can help in a way and at the same time learn with them.
Roy, I think that the question can be turned like this. The impact of climate change is accelerating both in the direct conditions that are inhabited by all of the living species and in the knowledge of climate change. It's a double impact. The interesting element is that it's so difficult to grasp what is happening. It's really difficult to imagine what is happening, and the images that we have in order to act are really not helping. They are connected to bonded entities, spatial organizations that are mid-size. The conditions of climate change are so vast and so unimaginable that not one organization, not one practice can really tackle them. So architecture can start articulating more clearly the specific forms of that series of impacts, the specific forms, the specific territorial organization of specific polities. And I think what is our task is really to make the impacts of the transforming Earth, the new Earth that we're all discovering, far more attainable, smaller, so that we can act on them. So it's really interesting that I think you mentioned that people question whether part of this is even architecture, but actually we need to really make things smaller in order for different organizations, different people, different groups, different populations and different cultures, different ways of thinking future, ancestral futures as well as modern future, attained with a specific outline of their territories. That means their material, energy, and information fluxes and flows that maintain a polity alive. I think once we start delineating these, which is an architectural practice, we might encounter other entities delineating their territories, and we will start having dialogues and hopefully not just contrasts around impinging territories one on top of the other, but more direct association with the forms that we inhabit. Also understanding that not only humans create forms, and that architecture is one practice generating forms, but there are multiple other forms making. We heard yesterday Saskia articulating her position on the forms made by finance and the brutal expulsions associated with that. The conditions that architecture can bring to the table are those of a spatial focus. And I think this is really the most important thing and lesson that I hope that architecture can contribute to the discussion. I mentioned COP being a failure. The COP is a failure for a very simple reason, that it doesn't even try to mention that we should keep oil in the ground, we should stop carbon usage, we should even take away the entire structures of gas. Now we're talking about being carbon neutral, and the carbon that we will have put in the atmosphere, the debris of the technosphere, by the time we are carbon neutral, will be enough for catastrophic change. But am I going to stop using oil and gas? Are you going to stop? No, nobody is able to disentangle themselves from oil. We should keep oil in the ground, but at the same time, it's what keeps us alive. And so the proposition from architecture, I think, is really to articulate clearly the specific forms that have wrought material spaces, information spaces, and energy fluxes that have been shaped by oil, in order to start disentangling ourselves from that. And the example of the Amazon forest or Antarctica are just one of the multiple examples of all territories being transformed by the technosphere that is just trying to metabolize oil. So the question is really, architecture can contribute, and maybe I think that we need to be alert to the fact that scale is not a property of things, of object, it's a property of navigation through representation of things and objects. And that's a realm that we can contribute to.
Yeah, many thanks, John, and many thanks, everyone. I think we are running out of time. I would love to continue the conversation, actually, but maybe I wonder if there's anyone in the audience who would like to participate, make a question. Please go ahead.
I do also want to say that many of the issues that you raised, specifically in relationship to Venice, will be addressed directly tomorrow in a symposium on Venice. And therefore, I think it's a very good bridge between the Symposium on Sustainability and one that is dedicated to the city because of the way that it highlights, exaggerates, celebrates, historicizes many of the challenges that you've highlighted today. So thank you all very, very, very much.
Thank you all. And yeah, I would also like to point out that certainly in a Biennale that is asked itself, how will we live together? This has been a particularly future, I would say, oriented panel as well, one like dealing with and clearly presenting some of the, I would say, more pressing problematics that we will have to face. So thank you, Julia, thank you, John, thank you, Gringo, for so clearly putting us in that direction. Well, see you all tomorrow.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Ciao a tutti.